It was a quiet afternoon in Mr. Wilson's classroom. He was arranging papers on his desk, his face calm but tired. The students sat lazily at their desks, waiting for the bell to ring. Some whispered among themselves, others stared at their phones, and a few glanced up, pretending to pay attention. Mr. Wilson cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice steady but carrying an edge of emotion. "Today," he said, looking at the class, "I want to share a story about someone who taught me as much as I taught them." His words immediately caught the attention of a few students. Mr. Wilson was not the kind of teacher who often shared personal stories. The room grew a little quieter, though the curiosity hadn't fully set in yet. He paused, taking a deep breath, and his eyes drifted toward the window. "Years ago, there was a student, a boy named Jamal," he continued, his voice softer now. "He wasn't the loudest in the room. In fact, most of the time, you wouldn't even notice him. But he had something special, something you don't see every day." One of the students at the back smirked, whispering something to his friend, but Mr. Wilson ignored it. His mind was already somewhere else, lost in memories. He could see Jamal as clearly as if it were yesterday. A quiet boy sitting in the corner of the room, his eyes downcast but filled with a hunger for something more. "Jamal wasn't like the others," Mr. Wilson said, glancing at the class. "He didn't have the best clothes. He didn't bring fancy lunches, and sometimes he didn't even have a notebook. But he had questions. Oh, the questions he'd ask." Mr. Wilson smiled faintly, but the smile faded quickly. "The truth is, not everyone saw what I saw in him. To most people, he was just another poor kid from a poor neighborhood." The room was silent now. Even the students who weren't paying attention before had stopped what they were doing. Mr. Wilson's tone had shifted. There was a weight to his words that hung in the air. "But the world wasn't kind to Jamal," he said, his voice growing heavier. "I remember the day I saw him being cornered in the hallway by a group of boys. They called him names I can't repeat here, names that would make you sick to your stomach. And Jamal, he just stood there. He didn't fight back. He didn't even look them in the eye. He just took it, like he had taken it 100 times before." Mr. Wilson paused, letting the silence sink in. Some of the students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't used to hearing their teacher talk like this. "I wanted to help him," Mr. Wilson continued. "I really did. But sometimes helping someone isn't as easy as it seems. Sometimes you don't even know if what you're doing is making a difference." He shook his head as if trying to shake off the memories. "But there was this one moment, this one conversation that I'll never forget." His voice cracked slightly, but he steadied himself. "It was after school one day. Jamal stayed behind, like he always did. I asked him why he didn't go home, and do you know what he said?" The room was silent, waiting for the answer. He said, "Because home isn't where I belong. Not yet." A murmur went through the room, and Mr. Wilson smiled faintly. "I didn't know what he meant at the time, but looking back now, I think I do." He stopped, his eyes scanning the room. The students were hooked, leaning forward in their seats, waiting for more. But Mr. Wilson didn't say anything else. Instead, he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote a single word on the board: belonging. Before anyone could ask what it meant, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," Mr. Wilson said, his voice steady again. But as the door creaked open, his face changed. It wasn't the usual interruption. Something was different. Something was about to happen. Jamal lowered his gaze for a moment, the confident exterior cracking just enough for the room to feel the weight of his words. The students sat in utter silence, their usual boredom replaced by an almost unbearable curiosity. Mr. Wilson took a hesitant step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" Mr. Wilson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What didn't you tell me?" Jamal took a deep breath, his eyes now fixed on Mr. Wilson's. "That day I left. It wasn't just about my mom losing her job. It was more than that." His voice faltered for a moment, but he steadied himself. "Do you remember how I used to stay late after class? How I never wanted to go home?" Mr. Wilson nodded slowly, his mind racing through memories he hadn't revisited in years. "You said home didn't feel like where you belonged." Jamal smiled faintly, but it wasn't a happy smile. "That's because home wasn't safe for me, Mr. Wilson." The words hit like a thunderclap. Some of the students glanced at each other, unsure how to react. Mr. Wilson's face fell, his grip tightening on the edge of his desk. Jamal, Jamal raised a hand, stopping him. Let me explain, he said, his voice growing stronger now, though it carried a heavy sadness. My mom, she was doing her best, working 3 jobs just to keep us fed. But there were people in our neighborhood who didn't like that we were trying to get out. They didn't like that I wanted to be something more than what they expected me to be. He paused, his jaw tightening, as if he was trying to hold back emotions that had been buried for years. There were nights when they'd come to our door, banging, yelling, threatening us. My mom was terrified. She told me to keep my head down at school, to not make a fuss. She didn't want to give them any reason to come after me. And then one day, they did. The classroom felt like it was holding its breath. Every pair of eyes was locked on Jamal, and even the most disinterested students were now hanging on to his every word. Jamal's voice wavered, but didn't break. I was walking home from school just a few blocks away. I had that book you gave me in my hand, the one with the note you wrote, and then they stopped me. A group of them, older kids, some of them even adults. They surrounded me and started saying things I'll never forget. Mr. Wilson's hands clenched into fists, his face a mix of anger and guilt. What did they say? They told me I didn't belong here, Jamal said, his voice trembling. That kids like me didn't deserve to dream about a better life. They ripped the book out of my hands and tore it apart right there in front of me. A gasp rippled through the classroom. Mr. Wilson's eyes filled with tears, but Jamal wasn't done. And then they said if they ever saw me walking home alone again, they'd make sure I never made it back. Mr. Wilson's voice cracked as he spoke. Jamal, why didn't you tell me? Jamal shook his head, his expression one of quiet resignation. Because I knew you'd try to help, and I knew if you got involved, they'd come after you too. I couldn't let that happen. The room was so silent that even the faint hum of the classroom clock felt loud. Mr. Wilson opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Jamal took another deep breath, as if trying to expel the weight of the memories. So when my mom got the chance to move us out of there, we didn't think twice, Jamal continued. We packed what little we had and left that same night. I wanted to come back to say goodbye, but I couldn't. I was scared and ashamed. Scared? Ashamed? Mr. Wilson said, his voice rising slightly. Jamal, you had nothing to be ashamed of. Jamal smiled faintly again, but this time there was a hint of warmth in it. Maybe not, but back then, I didn't know how to feel anything else. Mr. Wilson took another step forward, his voice soft but filled with conviction. Jamal, you were just a kid. You didn't deserve any of that. None of it. Jamal nodded, his eyes glistening. I know that now, but back then, all I had was your voice in my head, telling me I was capable of greatness, telling me I mattered. The weight of those words hung in the air, and Mr. Wilson felt his chest tighten. The students, who had been silent throughout, now looked at Mr. Wilson with new eyes, seeing him not just as their teacher, but as someone who had changed a life. And then with a deep breath, Jamal said, But that's not why I'm here today, Mr. Wilson. There's more to the story, and it's something you need to hear. Mr. Wilson's hands trembled as he held the book, the edges worn from years of being opened and closed. The note he had written on the first page stared back at him, faint but unmistakable. Jamal, never forget that your dreams are valid, and your voice matters. You are capable of greatness, no matter what the world tells you. Minus Mr. Wilson. As he read the words aloud, his voice cracked, each syllable heavy with emotion. The classroom, already captivated, now seemed to hold its collective breath. Mr. Wilson looked up at Jamal, his eyes glassy, his lips trembling. I never thought these words would mean so much, he said softly, his voice almost breaking under the weight of his guilt and pride. Jamal's expression softened, a faint, bittersweet smile spreading across his face. It wasn't just the words, Mr. Wilson. It was the way you looked at me back then. Like I mattered. Like I was more than the angry kid everyone else saw. You saw me when no one else did. And that saved me. The silence in the room was profound, every eye fixed on the two men. Some students were visibly emotional, their faces wet with quiet tears, while others sat frozen, absorbing the moment. Mr. Wilson placed the book gently on his desk, his fingers lingering on its faded cover. He looked up, his voice trembling, but filled with conviction. "I wish I could have done more, Jamal. I wish I could have protected you from all of it." Jamal's smile grew stronger, though his eyes betrayed the pain he still carried. "You did more than enough. You gave me hope, Mr. Wilson, and hope was something I didn't think I'd ever have." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken gratitude and shared pain. Then, a hesitant voice broke the stillness. "Mr. Wilson?" one of the students called out, her voice soft and unsure. Mr. Wilson turned, his tear-filled eyes meeting hers. "Yes." The girl hesitated for a moment, then pointed to the book on the desk. "Can I borrow that after class? I think I'd like to read it." A faint chuckle escaped Jamal's lips, and Mr. Wilson let out a small laugh, wiping at his eyes. "Of course," he said warmly. "In fact, I think everyone in this room should read it. Maybe it'll remind you all that you're capable of greatness, just like Jamal." Jamal turned to face the students, his gaze sweeping across the room. His voice was steady, but his words carried a depth that struck everyone to their core. "Listen," he began, "you all have something special inside you. Don't let anyone take that away. Don't let the world tell you that you're not enough, because you are. And if you ever feel like giving up, remember this: there's always someone who believes in you, even if you don't know it yet." The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but no one moved. The students remained seated, their eyes fixed on Jamal, their faces a mixture of awe and emotion. The weight of his story, of his words, kept them rooted in their chairs. Jamal turned back to Mr. Wilson, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with sincerity. Mr. Wilson didn't hesitate. Instead of shaking his hand, he pulled Jamal into a hug. It was the kind of hug that spoke of years of unspoken understanding and a bond that couldn't be broken. "No, Jamal," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you." As the hug ended, the students began to stir. Some gathered their belongings while others stayed behind, hesitating at their desks, as if they didn't want the moment to end. A few approached Jamal, shyly asking questions or thanking him for sharing his story. The classroom, once a place of routine and monotony, now felt electric with inspiration. The usual chatter and noise were replaced with quiet conversations filled with awe and respect. Jamal walked toward the door, pausing just before he stepped out. He turned back to look at Mr. Wilson one last time. "Keep changing lives, Mr. Wilson," he said, his voice warm and full of hope. Mr. Wilson nodded, a renewed sense of purpose shining in his tear-filled eyes. "I'll try, Jamal. I'll try." Jamal smiled, and then he was gone, leaving the classroom in a silence that felt almost sacred. As Mr. Wilson turned back to his desk, his gaze fell on the book. He picked it up again, running his fingers over the cover, his mind racing with memories of the boy Jamal used to be and the man he had become. For the students, it was a moment they wouldn't forget. For Mr. Wilson, it was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness, the smallest gestures of belief, could ripple out into something far greater than he could ever imagine. And in that moment, he knew that his role wasn't just to teach, but to see, to believe, and to inspire. Jamal's story wasn't just his, it was a story of how hope could light even the darkest of paths. And for the first time in years, Mr. Wilson felt the kind of hope he had once given to Jamal. Jamal stepped out of the classroom, his heart heavy yet full. The hallway outside felt quieter than it should have been, as though the weight of what had just transpired had reached even beyond the walls of the room. He took a deep breath, his mind replaying every word he had spoken and every tear he had seen in Mr. Wilson's eyes. Inside the classroom, the students slowly began to gather their things, but their usual chatter was replaced by an unusual stillness. Some whispered softly to each other, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Others stared at the book on Mr. Wilson's desk, its frayed cover now a symbol of resilience and hope. Mr. Wilson sat at his desk, still clutching the book. He didn't move, lost in thought, his mind swirling with memories of Jamal as a child. The struggles, the defiance, the small victories, they all came rushing back. He glanced at the empty doorway where Jamal had stood just moments ago, and a deep sense of fulfillment mixed with lingering guilt filled his chest. One student, a boy named Caleb, lingered near the desk. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Wilson, do you think someone like me could, make it like Jamal did?" Mr. Wilson looked up, his eyes softening as he regarded the boy. Caleb was one of those students who often flew under the radar, quiet, unassuming, and, like Jamal once had been, full of unspoken potential. "Caleb," Mr. Wilson said gently, leaning forward, "you already have everything you need to succeed. You just need to believe it. And if you don't, then let me believe it for you until you do." Caleb's eyes widened slightly, a spark of hope flickering in his expression. He nodded, a small but determined smile tugging at his lips. As the students began to leave one by one, Mr. Wilson noticed a shift in the air. The room felt lighter, as though the story of Jamal had lifted an invisible weight they hadn't even realized they were carrying. Meanwhile, Jamal walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly. As he reached the exit, he stopped, his hand resting on the cold metal handle of the door. He turned back, looking down the empty corridor, memories of his school days flashing before him. He remembered the moments of humiliation, the taunts, the hopelessness. But he also remembered Mr. Wilson, the way he had spoken to him with kindness, the way he had handed him that book with a knowing smile, the way he had never once given up on him. Jamal smiled to himself, a bittersweet warmth filling his chest. He knew that what had happened today wasn't just about revisiting the past. It was about paying forward the hope that had been given to him. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the school grounds. Jamal pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages from the kids he mentored. Their words of gratitude and stories of triumph reminded him of why he had come back here in the first place. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a young boy he had been mentoring, a boy who reminded him far too much of his younger self. The message read, "I don't think I can do this anymore. It's too hard." Jamal's heart clenched. He typed back quickly, his thumbs flying over the screen. "Yes, you can. You're stronger than you think. Trust me, I've been where you are, and I'm still standing. You're not alone." He hit send, his resolve hardening. As much as today had been about closure, it was also a reminder that his work was far from over. Back in the classroom, Mr. Wilson looked out the window, watching as Jamal's figure disappeared into the distance. He turned back to his desk, picking up the book once more. This time he opened it to the last page, where a faded, forgotten, sticky note was tucked away. The note read, "Sometimes the smallest things we do can have the biggest impact. Never stop believing in the power of kindness." Mr. Wilson smiled, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He folded the note carefully and tucked it back into the book. Then, standing tall, he faced his next group of students, ready to pass on the lessons he had learned. Not just as a teacher, but as someone who knew the profound impact of believing in another human being. Jamal's story wasn't just a memory now. It was a legacy, one that would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that neither of them could fully comprehend.